So we've talked about passive diffusion, which allows molecules to cross the membrane really without help. They don't need any energy, they don't need any assistance, they just go. You also have something called facilitated diffusion. So facilitated basically means that these molecules are going to get some kind of help from a protein. These proteins are generally called channel proteins, okay, or transport proteins. So facilitated diffusion is diffusion that goes through a transport protein or through a channel. Okay, so these proteins are basically designed to kind of create a hole through the membrane. Okay, now these holes aren't necessarily open to anything and everything. Generally, these transport proteins are specific to a single molecule. Okay, so they are, it's not just like you have this wall around your fortress and all of a sudden you just knock a hole in the middle of the wall. Okay, it's basically a guarded gatehouse that requires a very specific password to get through. Okay, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about with these transport proteins. You also have what's known as active transport. So active transport also uses a protein of some kind, but it also uses energy, so ATP, energy in the form of ATP, in order to transport these molecules into the cell. And generally the reason it has to be active is because it's working against a concentration gradient. Okay, so it's going up the concentration gradient instead of just down it. Okay, so this isn't passive. You actually have to basically push the molecule into the cell, or in other words, like pull it in. Okay, so it is powered by ATP. So the ATP will bind some type of transport protein that works for active transport, and that will form basically a transport pump. So it's working to pull all of those molecules in that it can find. Okay, and so the cells use active transport in order to maintain homeostasis. Okay, so they will pull in what they need. It may be something that they don't use constantly, okay, so they can't keep the concentration inside the cell low, but it could also be something that has to be built up inside the cell in order for it to be useful. Okay, so there are a lot of different reasons that it'll use active transport in order to pull something in against the concentration gradient. All right, so final two things that we're going to talk about with cell membranes. So again, cell membranes are very fluid. Okay, so they aren't just for protection. They do a lot more for the cell than you might generally think. And so there are two more things about the cell membrane and about how it moves. So first up, we've got endocytosis. So in endocytosis, remember it sounds kind of like in, so it's pulling something into the cell. So in endocytosis, it will actually, basically you have nutrients that come up to the side of the cell, and the cell is kind of like, hey, I want all of those in here. So it envelops all of those nutrients. So it basically forms a little indentation in the plasma membrane that encircles those nutrients. And then it pinches off that plasma membrane, the cell membrane, to create a vesicle. And so that contains all of the nutrients inside of the vesicle. Okay? And then it can break down the vesicle once it's inside the cell in order to get at those nutrients. Okay, so the nutrients started outside here, and then it kind of bubbles inward, okay, and then pinches off the membrane in order to get its nutrients. So it does use energy to transport material in vesicles. Generally, this is reserved for molecules that are so large that they would not be able to pass through the membrane, no matter what kind of proteins you have there. Okay? So endocytosis is the process of taking material into the cell. Oftentimes it's referred to as cell eating, okay, especially because there is one specific type of endocytosis called phagocytosis, which literally translates to eating, cell eating. And then you also have the reverse of that process. So this is known as exocytosis. So it's getting rid of large molecules by fusing a vesicle with the cell membrane. So instead of pinching the vesicle off, now you get a vesicle that goes up and just kind of butts up against the plasma membrane. And eventually it's going to fuse with that membrane. So anything that was inside of the vesicle all of a sudden is now pushed out of the cell. Okay, so this is, again, it uses energy to transport materials in vesicles. And again, it's for objects that are too large to pass through the membrane. So the cell has to get rid of them in some way. So it just kind of, just forces it out. So it does expel materials from the cell. All right, so that is it for this chapter.